How's it going, my awesome bunch of bakers? Hope you're having a great day. Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I have a very unique rye bread for you. It contains more seeds than flour, so let's go to the kitchen and check it out. You already know how much I love my rye bread, but there is one person who loves it even more, my brother. He bakes it all the time, sometimes several times a week. And there's nothing really unique about the method of his recipe. It's pretty much the same method that I like to use. What is unique is the ratio of ingredients. This rye bread has more seeds than flour. I had never made anything like this, and it took me a few tries to get it right. He measures his ingredients with cups. Of course, we use scales here, so I had to convert it. Also, his one is made with sourdough starter. I converted this to yeast. But if you want to use your starter, simply swap the yeast for 50 grams of sourdough. Right, let's just get to it and see what we need to make this. We'll need some whole grain rye flour, water, salt, yeast, and because we're fermenting this at room temperature for quite some time, we'll only use a tiny amount of yeast. Right, and here come the seeds. Got some chia seeds, sunflower seeds, linseeds, pumpkin seeds, and sesame seeds. Also, some raisins or currants, and some more sunflower seeds to cover the loaf. But you can of course use any seeds that you like. As for the equipment, we'll need a bowl, scales, a dough scraper, and a temperature probe. And finally, we'll need the loaf tin. This bread will comfortably fit in a 900 gram or 2 pound loaf tin. Now this dough is very sticky, and even though it's covered in seeds, it still may stick to the tin. So I would suggest you lining it with some non-stick paper. Here's how I like to do it. I cut out a rectangle. Make sure when you fold it up that the edges reach almost to the top of the tin. Now take your scissors and cut diagonal lines from the corners towards the middle. Don't worry about cutting too deep, because as you place the paper in, it will all fall into place. Sometimes those loose corners of the paper that you see can get in the way. So here's what you can do after you've cut the diagonal lines. Take your scissors and remove those corners. Now the paper will fit snugly in the tin and it's not going to get in the way. And this of course works exactly the same for when you're making a cake. Right, let's start preparing the seeds. If we just mix the seeds and the flour and the water and all the other ingredients, the dough and the resulting bread will be quite crumbly. We want the seeds to be part of the dough, instead of just floating around in it. So we must grind them down a little bit. A pestle and mortar works great for this. You can also use a food processor. Just make sure not to grind the seeds too much. You don't want to grind them down to a powder. Breaking them up by about 50% is fine. The finer they are, the drier your dough will be. And this bread is dense enough as it is. This is exactly how you want them to look. Right, let's clean down this mess and continue. Temperature control is extremely important for slow fermented bread like this. My kitchen is around 23 degrees Celsius. This dough rises very slowly, so it'll take around 12 to 16 hours at this temperature. We don't want it much warmer, because then it just may overproof. Now we're not kneading this dough, so to achieve the correct final temperature, I'm simply using room temperature water, which for some reason was cooler than my room, but the flour is warmer, and after mixing the dough, it should be at the right temperature. If your kitchen is cooler, simply use slightly warmer water, and if it's warmer, use colder water. Right, back to our dough. In a large bowl, combine the water, yeast, salt, all the seeds and the raisins, and then mix everything well. You want to dissolve the salt and hydrate the yeast. After that, add the rye flour. Now grab your scraper and slowly mix it to a dough. Mix it until there's no dry flour left. Of course, the dough scraper is your best friend here. You really don't want to use your hands when mixing a rye bread dough. This stuff is like glue. Once you have mixed it well, make sure you smooth out the surface. This will help us once we start rolling this dough in seeds. Speaking of seeds, now's the time. Take a large tray and pour the sunflower seeds in it in a nice even layer. Now grab your dough scraper and once again, make sure that the dough is nice and smooth. Release it from the bowl and drop it onto the seeds. I recently published a wheat bread dough recipe using the same method. It's also a no-knead dough. You simply mix it, roll it around in some seeds, place it in a tin and then bake it on the next day. So if you're enjoying this so far, make sure to check out that video later on. Now make sure you don't leave any exposed dough on this loaf. Just roll it around until the seeds stick no more. There's one important thing to note. Try not to fold the dough. If you fold it, the seeds will go inside it. And there's plenty of seeds already in there. So just roll it around, cover the surface, don't forget the ends. And this is what it should look like once you're done. You can save the leftover sunflower seeds for the next project. Okay, so the best way of placing this loaf in the tin is by first placing it on the paper. If you first place the paper in the tin and then try to add the loaf, it'll be a disaster. This method gives you much more control. I use this method every time I line my tins. And of course this would never work with a cake, but it works perfectly with bread. Once you have placed it in a tin, use the palm of your hand to press it into shape. We just want to ensure that it gets in all the corners. Of course the dough will spread out as it ferments and rises, but because it's quite dense, it may not fully reach the corners of the tin. Okay, let's do a quick temperature check. 23.3 degrees, just about right, and that is around 73 Fahrenheit for my American friends. Now we can cover this up and leave it at room temperature to ferment till the next day. And the reason why I say it takes 12 to 16 hours is because the temperature in your kitchen may drop during night. I think I ended up fermenting this for around 13 hours. But there's no rush to bake it, it's hard to overproof this. Make sure you preheat your oven, 180 degrees Celsius fan off, that is 356 Fahrenheit. There is one very clear indication that you should be looking for. Your loaf should have nice big cracks on the surface. It means it's puffed up and it's ready for the oven. If you don't see these cracks, do not bake your bread yet. Just leave it for longer, even if it takes a couple more hours. This is a dense dough. You need to let it rise. My one is clearly ready for the oven, but before I place it in there, I'm gonna spray it with some water. This bread will be baking for quite some time, and the top crust will be exposed to the heat for most of it. So spraying it generously with water will prevent it from getting too dry. Now let's pop it in the oven and bake it for 1 hour. You may think, wow, 1 hour? Surely it must be done. But it's not. It is dense and it contains a lot of water, so we're only about 2/3 of the way there. Remove the loaf, remove the paper, and place it back in the oven for another half an hour of baking. This will of course depend on the shape of your tin. If it's longer and not as high, it may take less time. You can just measure the temperature of the loaf. If it reads above 94 degrees Celsius or 200 Fahrenheit, it's ready. After baking, it's a good idea to wrap it in a clean cloth. I've been doing this lately because it really helps the bread retain its moisture. Even though this was fully baked, it was not ready yet. We need to let it cool down properly. Bread like this develops its crumb and flavor in time. I like to leave it for around 12 hours before I cut into it. But if you are really impatient, you could start cutting it up in about 4 hours. But if you do it too soon, whilst it's still warm, it will be gummy inside. You may even think that it's raw, but it's definitely not. I mean, we baked it for an hour and a half. Patience will definitely reward you here. This kind of bread is best cut nice and thin. It is dense and hearty and full of flavor. If anything, thick slices make it worse. And if you slice it thinly, you'll get many portions out of it. And it will stay fresh for many days. You could easily keep this for a whole week and it'll still be fine. But I don't think it could ever last that long before being eaten, right? So what do you think this recipe? What's the most seeded bread you've ever tried? Let me know down in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this one, click over here. Subscribe to the channel, click right here. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.